Hi, I'm Brad Dunning, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. It's the holiday season, and we have a warning for you. Be careful about giving a coffee table book to your architecture-lovin' spouse for Christmas. Why? Because one day you might have a new modernist house by a famous architect, plus a railroad on your property. Joining us today is Seattle brand designer Lou Maxon and his long, strange journey to build a Tom Kundig house with a very unique Kundig gizmo. Later on, returning podcast guest Peter McMahon of the Cape Cod Modern House Trust shares his group's wildly successful preservation of modernist cottages. We'll talk about their new campaign to buy and restore the Marcel Breuer house in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, largely untouched since Breuer died over 40 years ago. And now, still crazy after even more than 40 years, your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. Paul Simon made the song Still Crazy After All These Years a huge hit in 1975. What most people don't know is that jazz crooner Rosemary Clooney recorded the song too, almost 20 years later. Yes, she was George Clooney's aunt. And even more obscure, the song is on Karen Carpenter's final album, released after her tragic death from an eating disorder. Her passing ushered in a new era of awareness about eating disorders that had long been ignored. Over the years, I've discovered a rich legacy of songs that elevated her incredible alto voice in my personal Hall of Fame, especially her version of Have Yourself a Merry Christmas. That's the voice you want under the mistletoe during the holidays. Did you know that she was named one of the best drummers in the world?
No.
You can watch her drumming videos on YouTube and, of course, her songs. Karen Carpenter's version of the Paul Simon song was never a hit, just like so many architects' versions of Wright and Neutra and Mies houses that were never popular in their communities. Yet over time, say 20 or 40 or 60 years, these houses, still crazy after all these years, have become a beloved part of our collective history. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Seattle native Lou Maxon is what they used to call an ad man. He designs brand identities, provides creative direction and design for global campaigns, organizes brand events, and brings brand stories to life. He does not brand cattle.
Good.
A graduate of Gonzaga University.
Go Bulldogs!
He is a regular columnist for Dwell, and he still finds himself at his alma mater teaching courses at Gonzaga over the past 20 years. He commutes to work on his own railway line, part of a Tom Kundig designed railway, and of course, this ad man that has made that railway world famous. Welcome, Lou.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Lou, our ACE research team has discovered that your childhood obsessions were hockey and lacrosse, and design only came later. So how do you factor in your stick-loving athleticism into modernism?
Well, I think team sports, just like architecture, it requires a lot of different players, and everybody has a very specific role. And if people sort of overlap where they shouldn't, then the end result doesn't always quite work out. So I think it's a good preparation for being a client, or in my case, with the studio project, a contractor and a client, which is probably also very, very dangerous.
So you don't want two forwards, but no goalie.
Yeah, exactly. I think I also tended to pick the very unusual sports that required a little bit of a different skill set. And as you know, modernism, I think for me, the way I looked at it was less about a specific aesthetic and more about just changing the way you live in your environment. And it's also about editing down to just simplicity. For my wife and I and for our family, it seemed like coming from like unusual sports of hockey and lacrosse to modernism didn't seem too strange once we arrived there.
After school, you worked in New York and in Seattle for Seattle Magazine. I'm intrigued. What was the no Space Needle rule at Seattle Magazine?
Well, I had worked in New York at Time Out New York magazine, which is like a weekly city magazine. And that magazine was specifically for people who lived in New York, and it was sort of an insider look. So they didn't have the sort of usual tourist spots. When I got to Seattle magazine, I was always sort of annoyed that the outside perception of Seattle was, throwing fish at the market, Pearl Jam, the Space Needle. So the first thing I did was, the magazine was really for an insider magazine for people who lived here, not just a magazine you pick up in your hotel to see what to do. And so this no Space Needle rule was really kind of a filter to make sure that the insights and the design and the experience of the subscribers and people who picked it up really got the inside track on what it's like to live here and explore around the city. And while the Space Needle is certainly amazing, and especially now after the Olsen Kundig remodel of it, it's definitely not the only thing. I think you'd be missing out if you came to Seattle and only experienced the Space Needle, because I think the city has much more in addition to that to offer in terms of
there's Eddie Vedder.
Culture. Yeah,
there's coffee.
Yeah, there's coffee. Yeah,
there's much more than that.
Exactly.
Lou, tell us how this house got started. I understand that it was a coffee table book about Tom Kundig's work.
Yeah, we call it the most expensive book we've ever purchased. I actually got the book twice, I think, for Christmas.
And when was this? Give us a year.
I think this is like 2007.
Okay.
2006 or 2007. We lived in New York. We moved back to Seattle actually right before 9/11. We'd moved back to Seattle. We lived in the city, and then we kind of moved out a little bit to the suburbs, sort of in this area called Snoqualmie, which is, world famous for the Snoqualmie Falls and also home of Twin Peaks.
Yes, Twin Peaks, I was going to say. That is,
Yeah, Snoqualmie, North Bend, Twin Peaks. We had lived in a planned community, which was great because our kids were small and you have sort of instant friends and neighbors. But over time, as the family grew and the community, it was like a gremlin. It just duplicated and got more dense. And we had left the city, which was dense. We started to explore. And one day I was at work and my wife had emailed me because we started to look at land. And she's like, I found this parcel over in this town called Carnation. It's like 21 acres. That seems gigantic after living in New York. So we checked it out. And, we had first thought like, hey, we're going to buy some land. We'll get like a plan house or we'll do maybe a prefab or something. And then we got the book and I was kind of looking for something different. My wife, we both agreed that we were going to do something kind of different. We weren't quite sure that we were going to hire an architect or do a plan. But when we got Tom's book, it sort of, I think aside from the fact that we selected them, it's like that first book is one of the best architectural books I had ever seen. And I'd collected a lot over the years and at Seattle Magazine and also when I was a creative director and design director for Lexus, I had shot and directed a lot of photo shoots in and around Seattle at Modern Homes. So I had been in Modern Homes designed by Olsen Kundig and different notable architects out here without really knowing who they were. And it was until I saw that book and I thought, wow, this is like, I think this is it. So I went to the website and sent a note and hit send and it sort of went off into the ether. And then one day I got a call and that's how it all started.
So you engaged Tom to design your house.
Yep.
And your original plan, I believe this is right, was to build it yourself and film a documentary as you were building it?
I wasn't necessarily to build it ourselves. It was more one of the production partners I work with had an interest in kind of documenting what the process was like to do this from beginning to end. So they actually shot a lot of footage, like still photos of it going up and some of the meetings. We actually attended the famous Olsen Kundig crit, which happens on Thursdays at the end of the day. So I got to be a fly on the wall in that. They tape that.
What is this called?
It's the Olsen Kundig critique. So basically every Thursday from the beginning of time, since they were founded, everybody sort of stops what they're doing at like 4, pencils down, and they gather, and one of the partners and the team present a project that's sort of in progress. I think kind of like it's like in schematic, but it hasn't traveled too far so that the firm, sort of the broader firm expertise, can weigh in, and the principals will pose specific questions about the project they're presenting that are sort of open-ended to see if there's ways to improve or elevate that project using the non-bias of the broader firm expertise that, you know, isn't in the mix on it day to day. So we were at a point where they talked about, is the house, is it sort of anchored on top of the land? Is it sort of immersed in the land? And then Phil Turner, who, you know, works with Tom on the kinetic elements, shared a lot of the details and early thinking around the studio. So it's like an hour or so meeting, you know, pizza, beer, and lively conversation.
That must have been fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting just to see, you know, because at that time we were just talking about the studio moving, but other people at the firm were like, well, what if the whole house could move? You know, and then you're the client, you're thinking, wow, this could be an expensive meeting.
Because Kundig's firm has done that. They have a project called Rolling Huts,
where
the whole things are actually on wheels.
Yeah, they're on wheels, and we've actually stayed there. They don't necessarily move. It was more of a creative code pivot, but in our case, like the entire building actually moved. So, I mean, not the house, but the studio.
Oh, so, this is the railway.
Yeah.
Yeah, the railway. But the house itself is fixed. I mean, it's on foundation.
So for our listeners, let me explain so you can put this in your imagination. So you got a house, and on this house is a regular office where Lou works from. But when you walk into your office and you want to actually commute to work, what happens next, Lou?
Okay, so the house is one story. It's about 115 feet long, and you get to the master bedroom is at the end, and there's like a little platform where you can walk out and, you know, be outside, or the studio is there and has a platform that meets the platform of the deck outside the master bedroom, and the canopy and the platform.
It's a train station.
And the way that it's designed is that basically the studio is 2 stories and the house is 1 story. So the beginning of the second story is like at the roof line of the house. So there's a notch that we designed into the roof of the house so that when the studio is nested with the house, it becomes kind of a vertical element or a tower, but it protects you from the elements. If if it's raining, which it does here, you can walk in literally without getting soaked, and then you can just sit at the desk and work. Or we have a reclaimed General Motors electric diesel locomotive panel that's mounted on the wall that was once on a Burlington Northern locomotive, and you put this big steel brass reverser key in and you push it to the left, and the electric self-powered locomotive office starts cruising down the railway, and you can park it wherever you want.
Now, how long is your railroad, Lou?
Yeah.
The railroad's 110 feet, and so it's almost as long as the house, but you're traveling from this beautiful open view of the valley of like farmland and the Olympic Mountains in the distance to a dense forest. So you're kind of traveling into this forest, so the light changes as you move down the railway. And the rails themselves, I mean, they're real railroad tracks. They were rolled in the early 1900s, and the rails came from the Great Northern Railway, which once came to our town in the early 1900s. There was a branch line of the Great Northern. So you could at one point go into town, get on the train, and take it all the way to Chicago or Seattle.
So it's like you've got a private railroad car.
Yes.
But
A two-story railroad car.
and a private railroad.
Yeah.
That must be amazing to have your office move into the woods.
Yeah, you can work wherever you want along the railroad track, depending on the light. And then there's an upstairs too, so that's accessible by a ladder. And then there's a full library upstairs. And so the studio itself was inspired by the caboose, which was the office of the railroad. It was, the last car on the train where the brakeman and conductor would be, and there was paperwork. And then it had a cupola, in many of the cabooses where you would climb up and you could see what was happening down the railroad. You could look over the rail cars, you could see if there was a fire, you could see if the train was getting robbed. So in our case, the studio is the caboose and the house is sort of the train because we can see over the top. But downstairs is really about working. There's like a 10-foot cantilevered desk, and we have 10 feet wide by about 26 feet tall of glass. So it's kind of like an observation car. If you took a beautiful rail observation car and put it in the blender with a caboose, there you have it. So you can work downstairs or you can climb up and go upstairs. There's 2 chairs and beautiful steel shelves, and you can listen to music on either floor. Upstairs is sort of for thinking and imagining new projects, and downstairs for getting down to work.
Well, of course, your rolling office has been compared to Mr. Rogers' trolley, taking people to the world of make-believe, right?
Yeah.
So how does it feel to be in there working?
It'll be a year that it's been completed, but I really only moved in earlier this year. And then, after I moved all my stuff in and got settled, it's still very new to me. So there's some days, people ask, where do you park it? And, I still walk. So a lot of times I'll leave it at the end of the track. I'll get up and I'll walk out to it. And sometimes I'll start, like today, I start my day out there at the end of the track. Around lunchtime, or as the light changes, I'll probably move it to like the middle of the railway. And then I'll come home for lunch, and my wife and I will have lunch in the house. And then she'll send me off. I'll get back in and take it out.
I imagine that any children visiting your house must go nuts about this.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. In fact, we have had, obviously a lot of interest with the press, and I've been talking about this project for, such a long time. After a while, people are like, what, is this really real? So now that it's real, we've had, some friends and colleagues come over, and, some of them have brought their kids. And, of course, it's an experience, aside from the fact that it's me working in there, it's also sort of a little rolling museum of history of the railroad and my family's connection to advertising. My great-grandfather was an original madman of advertising from Detroit. I designed some tickets. So when people come over, we have 2 official stops, and I got an old conductor's rail punch from like 1900. Right. And so I'll punch the ticket, and we have a ink stamp for the date, and I have a little notebook, and I started it because I was keeping track of every time I would move it for the fabrication team, because it took like 2 or 3 months to sort of get it right. We had to shim some of the segments just to, it's pretty smooth and it's electric, but it is a rail car. So, it's going over.
I was wondering if you had any problems with zoning.
I was thinking the building inspectors must have just flipped out when they're asked to come,
What building inspectors? No.
Therein lies the secret.
No. So when we went in for a permit on the house, the studio was on the plans, in a truthful but abstract way. It was like to test the waters and get a temperature on it. The reality is that you cannot permit a building that's not on foundation. It's basically like we've created a hot rod. There's no precedent for this. So, we built it beyond code, but there's nothing, they don't even know where to begin. And in fact, they were like, we don't, just leave us a message and tell us you're doing it, but we don't want to have anything to do with it because we can't even you know.
Does your house have a whistle?
I have like an old wooden rail whistle in the studio, and our property is 21 and a half acres. And then we actually ended up buying the property behind the railroad tracks just because we didn't want anyone building. But I'm sure like people in the valley, if you're driving through, you know, and you look up and you see this building moving, they're probably guessing the world is coming to an end. And there is a small, like I wouldn't call it an amusement park, but it's near town, and they have like a narrow gauge little tourist railroad that goes around the park, and they have a whistle. So I just have to make sure my whistle is louder than their whistle. So we may have a little railroad wars here. There were two railroads that used to come through town, and our house and our railway is parallel to where those railroads ran in the valley.
That is fascinating. Now, someone influential once said this quote, "I like the impossible because there's less competition." Who said that?
Well, I think that was Walt Disney, wasn't it?
I think that was you.
Oh, no. Well, I think I borrowed that from Walt Disney. It reminded me a little bit in Tom's book. In the first book, there was a quote that says, "Only common sense happens when common sense prevails." And I think I was really attached to that, you know, because you really only can get to something really amazing if you're willing to take the risk. And I think that's kind of how I've fared in my professional work, is when everybody goes one way, you know, I go the other. And I think it's like that Gretzky quote about skating to where the puck's going, not to where the puck is, and to tie it back. And, you know, with the studio, all I said was, I don't want to have an office in my house. I had an office in a house before. That was like the brief, right? And Tom, to his credit, asks the big questions. It didn't start off with like, hey, we're going to give you a train, or I didn't say, hey, I want a railroad. It was more like, what if we did this? Almost sort of like offhanded.
Yeah.
And then as we explored it, and there was a similar project that they were coming off of where they did explore some of the kind of kinetic possibilities of it. The priority was the house. So we got the house done. And then once we had the kind of schematic design and some of the details for the studio, there was like a baton pass from Tom to me. But at that point, it was really sort of only what they drew up. It was really my investigation of like local history here and the railroads. And I got super into trains, and I did a lot of research. We traveled to Japan. We went on Amtrak across the country a couple times, went up to Alaska, just investigated the way railroads are built around the world. And then that brought a lot more story and meaning. So by the time we were ready, you know, I signed up to sort of manage it directly, and then worked with fabricators. You know, I think the end result was even more special because it sort of combined the beginning of what Tom and the group had drawn up and imagined, and then we sort of combined a little bit of wizardry from both ends and made something. I think it was like a 1 + 1 = 3. And then it works, right? So I think that's the other thing about the kinetic thing. It's very complicated to plan and execute something simple, because at the end of the day, like a child technically could walk in there and drive it. It has safety precautions, so it automatically will stop at either way, at either direction, no matter how fast you're driving it. So you have to figure all that stuff out. But at the end of the day, the purpose of it, I think Tom talks about this, like it has to be sort of like farmer simple, like, because the purpose of it, I mean, as much fun as it is to like drive it back and forth, you know, like I am working there.
Yeah.
And it's to have a place to sort of be surrounded by inspiring things, but ultimately it's to work. And then for fun, you know, we had people over, and I take them for a train ride, but people are amazed. I mean, I remember like when it was prefabricated offsite, and then we assembled it on site. And the first time we had assembled it without the walls, and we hooked up a generator, my wife came out on the platform deck, and we took like the first ride, and you don't even know, like, is this going to work? You know, because it's not been done before. So
yeah,
it was a little, if you got like insurance people involved or lawyers or risk, you know, assessment,
don't do that.
Like it would have never happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. So It's really a joy. And I think the Mr. Rogers connection is that, in the work, whether you're an architect or anybody who's making something, we're taking inputs and then we're sort of putting aside the ones that we don't need, taking the ones that we do need, and we're going on a little bit of an adventure and we're leaving reality to go make. And then we kind of sort of bring those creations back to the audience that we're serving, our clients. And so every day, that's kind of how I feel. Like even on a day where I may not be doing something like mind blowing, like I got to do that work on a rail car. And so I think it's a little bit of joy. And this was all planned before COVID. The earliest sketch of this I think I have was like from 2009.
Right.
So, I mean, this was in the Wayback Machine, and we finished it and we were officially done like right before Thanksgiving. So it'll be just about a year, and we will have been through, a couple seasons. And I think I printed about 100 tickets. So I think so far we've had about 60 people come through, including 2 visits by all the interns from Olson Kundig who came out. And actually they came out right after it was done. And we had about 15 or 20 of them in the studio for story and second story. It was a little nerve-wracking because I hadn't taken that many people round trip, but
Well, how fast does it go?
So in a regular locomotive, the throttle has 8 notches. So like notch 8 could be up to like 140, 160. So we're like that's a regular locomotive. We're like, I think 6, maybe 7 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just kind of ambling along.
So,
Right.
I like to say it's like the Nerf gun of bullet trains. It's not about getting there quickly.
You can see this house and all of Tom Kundig's houses at usmodernist.org/Kundig. Thanks so much for joining us, Lou.
Thank you.
Cape Cod, that arm-shaped stretch of Massachusetts where New England goes for vacation, and summer is a verb. The sun, the ocean, the traffic, the clam chowder, the summer theater productions, and best of all, except for perhaps the clam chowder, the modernist architecture. There are more than 100 modernist houses representing a little-known treasure map of 1940s and 1950s experimental designs. Peter McMahon and the wildly successful Cape Cod Modern House Trust has been saving these and fixing them up for almost 20 years. They even make them available for the public to stay in. Peter is the co-author with Christine Cipriani of Cape Cod Modern, Mid-Century Architecture and Community on the Outer Cape. Here's George's conversation with Peter McMahon.
Peter, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here. You were a guest now 5 years ago.
Yes, I remember. Thank you.
You are the man at Cape Cod for modernism. Just this history of your organizing for houses and preservation and keeping your eye on the ball for things is just unrivaled in that region. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I really don't have much competition, but yes, I appreciate it. Nobody else wants the job.
Number one with a bullet. Tell our listeners, how did all these small mid-century houses on Cape Cod come about? What drew creative people to the Cape?
Well, the Cape was what's been called a Yankee backwater. And I was just reading something about how there wasn't even a road past Hyannis until after the Civil War. There was whaling and there was fishing and there was salt works. But it was a very remote place. And when Thoreau did his walks, Thoreau walked the length of Cape Cod a couple of times and wrote a book about it. There was a stagecoach. It took 2 days from Boston. It was a very remote place. It was really drifting sand dunes. And there was eventually a railroad, which kind of opened it up all the way to Provincetown. And that kind of opened it up for some writers and painters that started to come to Provincetown at the turn of the century. And then during World War I, when it was hard to get to Europe, a lot of more painters came to Provincetown. And in the 20s, 30s, some writers came to Wellfleet, some of them associated with Eugene O'Neill. And in some cases, they didn't have cars. They lived in New York and they'd get on the train and get off in Wellfleet. The town was very depopulated, so you could buy a house very cheap. There was a crash in whaling and fishing, so the town was semi-deserted. So there were writers and some painters, and then in the late 30s, we started to get what in my book, Cape Cod Modern, I called the Brahmin Bohemians, who were American self-taught designers who had been to Europe and seen early modern architecture. And they were kind of homesteading here. They were designing and building their own houses. They were farming. They were making art kind of off the grid and outside of anybody's purview. They started building kind of their own naive version of modernism, really out of whatever they could find. So in some cases, actual driftwood or pieces of old buildings. But a lot of them were painting studios. They were very ad hoc, but experimental, interesting modern buildings. That's how it started.
And then architects and artists came, and at some point, the National Park Service ended up with a lot of these. How did that happen?
Yeah, so basically in the 40s, some Europeans started to come down. Serge Chermayeff, Marcel Breuer came in the early 30s and bought 24 acres. So land was very, very cheap. And the Europeans started to trickle in, and the Saarinen family were here, the whole family, Florence Knoll, and all of their friends and students, and it started to be quite a scene. In 1959, the legislation to create the Cape Cod National Seashore Park was introduced by the Kennedys mostly to stop post-war overdevelopment. Everybody fought about that for 2 years, and it passed in 61. And if you'd started building your house in that 2 years, you were out of luck, and the park paid you the market value and gave you 20 to 25 years to live there before you had to vacate. So the park ended up owning a bunch of these houses, which they intended to demolish. So many of them just sat vacant and demolished.
And your organization, the Cape Cod Modern House Trust, has saved any number of these and kept them up. You're leasing them from the Park Service, right?
Yeah, so we have leased and restored 4 of them, and we use them for our programming. We rent them in the summer, which is how we self-fund. And we do a lot of school collaborations, artist residency, and a lot of tours and open houses.
You've been working on the Marcel Breuer house, though, as a special project for a long time. Mm-hmm. It is, as I understand it, exactly how Breuer left it when he passed away. Is that right?
Yeah, Breuer died in 81, and his wife Connie died in the early 2000s. And his son, Tamas, has been living there part of each summer, but not really maintaining it. So it's fallen into disrepair, and it needs a lot of love. The good thing is that nothing was moved or touched. And, when buildings when they're just in a holding pattern, it can be a good thing for preservation because everything is original.
How did you come about a deal to buy the house?
When I started this whole project, it started out as a research project. I curated this exhibit in Provincetown at the museum there in 2007, and that got me on this trail of trying to find all the modern houses, which nobody really had a grasp on how many there were. There's over 100, 125 really. And then also trying to locate all of the children and grandchildren of that moment who were still around, and the children of the clients, and some of the clients were still around. And so I actually grew up in a modern house in Wellfleet. When I was 10, my parents hired Charlie Zender to design a house. So I grew up in a modern house, and that's sort of how the whole thing started. As part of that, I got to know Breuer's son, Tamas, and over the years, we developed a friendship, and he started letting me kind of take care of things like, when a tree fell and was leaning on the house, or taking care of various practical things. And then a few years ago, he let me take the art out of the house and have it conserved and stored off-site because it was in danger, and some very important art. And then a couple of years ago, I took his books out, Breuer's books, because they were getting eaten by silverfish and, It's a very damp place here, and unheated houses are not a great place for conservation.
No, not at all. What are the plans now for the Breuer house moving forward? What do you need to buy the property and continue to conserve it?
Well, we have it under contract for $2 million. It's 4.2 acres. So that's a very big piece of land around here. And it's pristine woods surrounded by a national park. It borders on 2 glacial ponds. We call them kettle ponds here. They're sort of left over from the Ice Age. And the headwaters of the Herring River, which is an important river, which is undergoing a big restoration project now where they're going to make it tidal again. So it's a very important site ecologically for the water system here. Our goal is to raise 1.2 million. We are pre-approved for mortgage for 1 million. For the balance, it's 1.2 million because we're trying to pay for the campaign and soft costs. And then the town of Wellfleet, I don't know if you have it down there, but we have something called the Community Preservation Act that towns can opt into. It's a tax on real estate transactions that goes into a state fund, and towns can opt in or opt out. And you can use that money for historic preservation, open space, affordable housing, et cetera. So the trust has received 3 of those grants previously. So we had to go through a process of convincing the town that these were historic buildings, which wasn't easy because we have buildings from the 1600s here. And that was kind of a little paradigm shift for the town to concede to that. Then that has to be voted in town meeting. So you have to convince a majority of people in town meeting that it's a worthy project.
So when you buy the house, what will happen to it? Will people be able to stay overnight in it? Will it become a house museum? What will happen to it?
Well, with all our houses, basically during the season, the 4 houses that we have restored, donors can do weekly stays in the warm part of the year. And then we do most of our programming in the shoulder seasons. So the residency and our school programs, although we do tours all summer and we do at least 2 open houses a year. So we try to get as much public access as we can. Also, the people who do the weekly stays in the houses are mostly architects, academics, historians. So it's a really interesting group that stay in the houses. And, house museums are important, but there's something totally different about being able to stay in a building. It's a real time capsule. And then the other thing is that the landscape is frozen in time because it's a national park. So there's been zero development since the buildings were built. So they're spectacular houses in a spectacular place. It's hard to describe, but when you actually live there for a few days, you really get into the mindset of the people who built it.
I think it's amazing that these structures have survived at all. I mean, they were never intended to go beyond 20, 30 years, right?
Some are more substantial than others. One of the houses we did was the house of Paul Weidlinger, who was a famous structural engineer. And that house is very sturdy. His field was blast proofing and earthquake proofing. And then one of them is made of cement block. That's a very Frank Lloyd Wright, inspired house. And that's quite massive and, in its weight, not in its size, but it has a lot of mass. And then the Hatch cottage is like a butterfly. It's just perched, very, very light structure, although it has survived all the hurricanes since 1962. And then the Kohlberg house was a complete rebuild because it's up on top of a bluff on the Atlantic side where it got blasted with nor'easters, and it was almost rotted all the way through. So, yeah, the houses they're very different from each other.
If your group is not able to raise the money to buy the house from Tomasz, what happens to the house then?
Well, he would give it to a realtor and it would go on the market and it would probably be demolished because it's only 1,700 square feet. It's unheated and it's in disrepair, and you could build a house twice the size without a variance. So it's in severe danger of being demolished. And then the art would be given to an art dealer to be sold or auctioned, and the contents would be dispersed. But to finish that, what you asked about Breuer, what we're planning for Breuer is a bit different. So we want to really expand the programming. What we're planning to do is take the whole fall semester and do a work study fellowship. The house was designed and built at 3 different times. So there are sort of 3 different apartments with their own entrance and bathroom and fireplace and screen porch. So it's be kind of ideal for 3 scholars to stay there at a time. So what we're planning to do is partner with a university and do fellowships in historic preservation, habitat restoration, and archiving.
That would be amazing for someone in those fields to be able to spend time in that house, particularly since it has been left almost untouched for 40 years.
Yes, and we have a ton of archival material to go through and really examine and protect and figure out where that material is going to end up. One example of that is that Tomasz was a very good photographer, and Breuer, the last part of the building was a small apartment with a dark room that Breuer built for his son to encourage his photography. And then his son took thousands, literally thousands of photographs from the late 60s into the 80s of the house in all of its forms, with its additions, where all the furniture was. Everyone who visited, which included Bauhaus alumni and all the local artists and architects and everything. It's an incredible document of the house in all of that time when it really was a hub of activity. So Breuer really treated the house as a laboratory. He was always tinkering with it. He was always changing things. He was always making furniture and then taking it apart and moving it around. He loves cement blocks, and he made these amazing tables with it's a column of cement blocks with a giant piece of slate or wood on it. And then there's a combination of the manufactured furniture, which is very high tech, and then this very brutalist furniture that he made himself for the house. So it's a fascinating collection.
Peter, if people want to donate to help purchase the Breuer house, how do they do that?
Go to our website, Cape Cod Modern House Trust, just Google it. And right on the top of the landing page, you'll see a big red button that says Save the Breuer House. Really, the hill that we have to climb right now is the purchase price. We've made a good start on that with individual donations, and we are about to start a very serious grant writing cycle. That's our main challenge, is getting the purchase price together, which I think we can do. We have until June 2024 to raise the money.
And it may be a little late for 2023, but what about people that want to stay in one of your houses for next year? Where do they go?
Same place, just go to capecodmodernhousetrust.org. There's another button that says Stay in a Modern House, and that will take you to our admin who will show you what's available. There's also on that site, there are calendars so that you can see available weeks. We have 2 of our houses that are rentable year-round and 2 of them that are more seasonal.
Okay. Peter, you have just made such a wonderful gift to not only Cape Cod, Massachusetts, America, in keeping these houses from being so easily destroyed. Thank you so much.
All right.
It's a pleasure to talk with you again. Thank you.
It's just a hobby that got out of control.
I know all about that. Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom, take us on the A train.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.2 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Kelly Policelli. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another Madison Avenue Clio-worthy self-propelled edition of U.S. Modernist Radio. Woo-woo!